In 1872, a worker named John Myers descended into the Caisson beneath the Brooklyn Bridge. He was searching for solid bedrock beneath the East River, digging in a pressurized chamber more than 70 feet below the water's surface. The air pressure inside was crushing, nearly 40 pounds per square inch. Myers worked for hours in the dim light, his body adapted to the extreme pressure. Then, at the end of his shift, he ascended to the surface. He did it too quickly. Within hours, his joints began to ache. His legs became paralyzed. He screamed with pain so intense that even morphine couldn't stop it. 2 days later, John Myers was dead. What killed John Myers that day in 1872 would come to be called the Benz or Caisson disease, a mysterious affliction that struck down the workers who built the Brooklyn Bridge, one of the 19th century's greatest engineering achievements. Between 150 and 200 workers suffered from this disease. Over 20 died. Many more were permanently paralyzed. And here's what most people don't know. The Chief Engineer, Washington Roebling, deliberately minimized these deaths. He underreported the casualties. He refused to acknowledge the pattern of illness. He even continued pushing workers into the caissons despite knowing the risks, driven by his ambition to complete what his father had started. This is the story of the Brooklyn Bridge, but it's also the story of Caisson disease, the Benz, and the human cost of building America's most famous bridge. It's a story of workers who descended into pressure chambers they didn't understand, of a disease that wasn't discovered until it was killing men, and of official negligence that would haunt the project for decades. Welcome to Hidden America. This is the untold story of the Brooklyn Bridge and the curse of the caissons. In 1869, Brooklyn and Manhattan were separate cities. New York City had annexed much of Long Island, but Brooklyn remained independent and growing rapidly. Getting between the two cities required ferries, and in winter, when the East River froze, travel became nearly impossible. There were also practical considerations. Businesses wanted to move goods more quickly. The railroads wanted to expand their networks, and politicians saw an opportunity to consolidate the region under a single city government. A bridge spanning the East River would solve all these problems. The man chosen to design and build this bridge was John Augustus Roebling, a German-born engineer who had already built several successful suspension bridges across America. Roebling was a visionary, but he was also controversial. He had radical ideas about suspension bridge design that many older engineers thought were impossible. The Brooklyn Bridge would be the longest suspension bridge in the world, spanning 4,600 feet from anchorage to anchorage. It would be the tallest bridge, with towers reaching over 100 feet above the water's surface. It would require innovations never attempted before. Roebling designed the caissons himself. These were massive, watertight chambers, essentially enormous wooden and iron boxes open at the bottom. They would be floated out into the East River and sunk to the river bed. Once on the bottom, workers would dig out the sand and mud beneath them, allowing the caisson to sink deeper and deeper. Compressed air pumped into the caisson would keep the water out, creating a dry workspace beneath the river where men could dig until they reached solid rock. Only then could the bridge's towers be built. Roebling understood that this would be dangerous work, but he believed the caisson method was the only way to build the bridge fast enough and cheaply enough to make the project feasible. Construction began on January 3, 1870. Roebling threw himself into the work with characteristic intensity. He spent hours in the caissons with his workers, demonstrating his confidence in the system. It would be the decision that nearly killed him.
The first caisson for the Brooklyn Tower was sunk successfully, despite some difficulties. Workers descended into the high-pressure chamber, found the bedrock was deeper than expected, and the caisson was sunk to a depth of 45 feet. There were some cases of illness among the workers, but nothing alarming. Then came the Manhattan caisson. The Manhattan caisson had to go deeper, much deeper. Engineers discovered that the bedrock on the Manhattan side was 78.5 feet below the riverbed. That meant workers would be laboring at air pressures of 35 pounds per square inch. Nobody knew what would happen to human beings at such pressures. Nobody had ever tried to work at such pressures before. As the Manhattan caisson sank deeper, the pressure increased, and the illness began. Workers complained of sharp pains in their joints. Their limbs felt heavy and paralyzed. Some developed a rash that looked like a leopard's spots. Others couldn't catch their breath. Some vomited. The symptoms appeared hours after workers left the caisson, after they had ascended to the surface and the pressure on their bodies suddenly decreased. The workers had no name for this affliction. They called it the Caisson disease, or simply the bends, because their bodies would bend in agony from the pain. A doctor named Andrew Smith was brought in to study the condition. Smith correctly identified that rapid decompression was causing the problem. When the pressure decreased too quickly, gases that had been dissolved in workers' blood formed bubbles, creating embolisms. These bubbles could block blood vessels, cause paralysis, damage the nervous system, or stop the heart. Smith recommended that workers decompress slowly, spending time in intermediate pressure chambers before returning to normal atmospheric pressure. But here's what most people don't know. Even knowing the cause, even knowing how to prevent it, the illness continued to strike workers down. Why? Because the timeline for the bridge construction was brutal. Every day of delay cost money. Every delay risked losing political support or having the project canceled. Roebling pressured the workers to descend again and again, to work in the caissons for longer and longer hours despite the known risks. Between January 25th and May 31st of 1872, Dr. Andrew Smith treated 110 cases of Caisson disease. 3 workers died from the condition, 3 workers whose names are barely remembered today. But the actual number of deaths may have been higher. Some workers, afraid of losing their jobs, didn't report their symptoms. Some died after leaving the job, their deaths attributed to other causes. Some families were paid small sums to remain silent.
On June 28, 1869, something happened that would set the stage for tragedy. John Augustus Roebling, the chief engineer and designer of the Brooklyn Bridge, was at the ferry terminal taking measurements for the bridge towers. A boat accidentally struck his foot, crushing his toes. It seemed minor, a wound that could have happened to anyone. But within weeks, infection set in. Tetanus. Roebling developed a fever. His muscles began to seize. On July 28, 1869, he died. His son, Washington Roebling, was only 32 years old. He was devastated, but he was also determined. He would finish what his father had started. He would build the Brooklyn Bridge. He became the new chief engineer, taking over one of the most ambitious construction projects in American history. Washington threw himself into the work with the same intensity his father had shown. He spent hours in the caissons, demonstrating to his workers that their chief engineer wasn't afraid of the work, wasn't afraid of the pressure, wasn't afraid of the risks. What he didn't know was that those risks were accumulating in his body. In the summer of 1872, while working in the Manhattan caisson, Washington Roebling spent too long at depth. He ascended too quickly. He developed severe Caisson disease. His body became paralyzed. He was brought to the surface unconscious. For hours, doctors feared he would die. When he regained consciousness, he found himself unable to walk. For the rest of his life, Washington Roebling was essentially an invalid. The Caisson disease had destroyed him. But this is where the story becomes even more troubling. Washington Roebling didn't resign from his position. He didn't admit that the caissons were too dangerous. Instead, he retreated to his bedroom in a house overlooking the bridge construction. He watched the work through a telescope from his window. He issued orders through notes written to his wife, Emily, who then relayed them to the engineers on the site. Emily Warren Roebling was educated and brilliant. She had studied mathematics and engineering, and over the next 11 years, she became the de facto chief engineer of the Brooklyn Bridge. She spent her days on the construction site, coordinating the work, solving problems, dealing with politicians and contractors. She became so essential to the project that some people began to believe that Emily had actually designed the bridge, not Washington. But here's the crucial detail. All this time, all these 11 years, workers continued to suffer from Caisson disease. Workers continued to die. And Washington Roebling, from his bedroom, continued to minimize the problem.
The official records listed only 3 deaths from caisson disease, but workers knew better. They whispered about the true death toll. They spoke of men carried out of the caissons dying or permanently paralyzed. They spoke of families paid in cash to stay silent. The most telling incident came in May of 1872. 3 workers fell ill on the same day in the same shift in the Manhattan caisson. 2 died immediately. The 3rd died within days. 3 deaths in the caisson at virtually the same time. The implication was undeniable. The caisson was too dangerous. The pressure was too extreme. The conditions were killing people. What did Roebling do? He stopped the work temporarily, but not to address the danger. He halted construction because the bedrock was deeper than expected, which meant even greater pressures would be needed. He calculated that continuing would risk even more deaths. But rather than abandon the caisson method, rather than admit the danger, he made a different decision. He decided that the sandy soil overlying the bedrock was sufficiently firm. He ordered the caisson filled with concrete, abandoning the search for bedrock and settling for less than ideal conditions. It was a calculated risk. It was also a cover-up. The official narrative became that the work on the Manhattan caisson had gone deep enough. The conditions had been manageable. Workers had suffered from illness, but it was manageable. The true story, that 3 men had died, that the pressures were unsustainable, that Roebling had made a pragmatic decision to stop before even more workers were killed, was buried in technical reports and never mentioned in public.
Despite the setbacks, despite the illness and the deaths, the Brooklyn Bridge moved toward completion. The towers rose higher, the cables were spun, the roadway deck was installed piece by piece. In 1882, Washington Roebling's position as chief engineer was threatened. Some questioned whether he could possibly remain in charge while confined to his bedroom. Emily Roebling lobbied hard to preserve her husband's authority. Politicians and engineers supported her, respecting the work she had done. Washington remained officially in charge, and Emily continued to oversee the daily work. By 1883, the bridge was ready to open. On May 24, 1883, the bridge opened to pedestrians. 100,000 people walked across it on the first day. The next day, it opened to vehicular traffic. The newspapers celebrated it as a triumph of American engineering. President Chester Arthur attended the dedication ceremony. Politicians gave speeches about progress and ambition and the triumph of American ingenuity. Nobody mentioned caisson disease. Nobody mentioned the workers who had died or been permanently paralyzed. Nobody mentioned John Myers or the 2 other workers who died in May of 1872. The narrative that emerged was one of pure triumph, of engineering genius overcoming impossible odds. The human cost was downplayed, minimized, and ultimately forgotten. But here's what makes this story even more troubling. Emily Roebling,
who had essentially been the chief engineer for 11 years, was allowed to take only a brief walk across the bridge at the opening ceremony. She was given a seat of honor, yes, but she was not truly acknowledged for the central role she had played in the bridge's completion. The world had not yet learned to recognize women's contributions to engineering. Emily Roebling's work was acknowledged only in passing, while her husband, confined to his bedroom, was celebrated as the genius behind the bridge.
Today, the Brooklyn Bridge is one of the most famous structures in the world. Over 400,000 people cross it daily. It's featured in countless photographs, films, and artworks. Engineering students study its design. Tourists flock to walk across it. It's described as one of the greatest achievements of 19th century engineering. And in many ways, that description is accurate. But the story of Caisson disease is rarely told. The workers who suffered from the bends are barely remembered. Their names are forgotten. Their families received minimal compensation for the injury or death of their loved ones. The official death toll from the construction was claimed to be 20, though the actual number was likely higher. Some historians estimate that over 100 workers were seriously affected by Caisson disease, with at least 24 dying from it. The cause of Caisson disease wasn't fully understood until the 20th century, when divers began working at extreme depths. Scientists realized that the rapid decrease in pressure causes nitrogen that has been dissolved in the blood to form bubbles. These bubbles can damage the nervous system, cause paralysis, trigger strokes, or stop the heart. Today, prevention is simple. Decompression chambers and careful ascent rates eliminate the risk almost entirely. But in 1872, workers had no protection. Washington Roebling lived for another 44 years after the bridge opened. He never walked across it himself, confined to his wheelchair by the permanent effects of Caisson disease. Some believed his illness was a kind of curse, punishment for pushing workers into the caissons too hard, for minimizing the deaths, for prioritizing the bridge over human safety. Emily Roebling outlived her husband by many years. In her later life, she became an advocate for women's education and women's rights, drawing on her experience as an engineer on the Brooklyn Bridge. She had proven that women could master complex mathematical and engineering concepts, but it took more than a century for the engineering community to truly recognize women as capable engineers. Emily's legacy eventually became better known, but not until near the end of the 20th century. The Brooklyn Bridge survived for over 140 years. It's still considered one of the world's greatest engineering achievements. But it's also, and permanently, a monument to Caisson disease. The bridge carries the mark of that illness in its very structure. The caissons, sealed beneath the bridge with concrete, still exist beneath the East River. Inside them, pressurized at extreme levels for years, their interior spaces remain in a state of physical stress and pressure. In recent decades,
engineers have periodically examined the Brooklyn Bridge's caissons using underwater cameras and sonar. What they found was unexpected. The caissons contained hazardous materials, including lead paint and asbestos used in insulation. These chambers, filled with compressed air at extreme pressure for more than a century, have become sealed environmental chambers. The pressure inside remains abnormally high due to the concrete and the surrounding geology. It's believed that the pressurization could, in theory, maintain indefinitely. So beneath the Brooklyn Bridge, hidden from view, are these pressurized chambers from the 1870s. They're monuments to a time when workers' lives were considered expendable. They're sealed tombs containing the history of Caisson disease, of the bends, of workers whose names are forgotten, but whose sacrifice built one of the world's greatest bridges.
The Brooklyn Bridge stands as a triumph of human engineering. It's also a tragedy. It's beautiful, but built on suffering. It's revolutionary, but built with ignorance of the dangers. And it's a testament to both the brilliance of Washington Roebling's design and the complicity of his decisions to continue pushing workers into conditions he knew were causing illness and death. Washington Roebling never fully recovered from Caisson disease. Emily Roebling never received full credit for her role in the bridge's construction. And the workers who died were forgotten. Their names are lost to history. Their families received minimal compensation. Their sacrifice was erased from the official narrative. But evidence still exists. In the New York Historical Society archives, there are letters from workers' families requesting compensation for injuries or deaths. There are medical records from Dr. Andrew Smith documenting Caisson disease cases. There are construction reports with suspicious gaps and inconsistencies. The full death toll, the complete story, remains partially hidden. It took historians decades to reconstruct what actually happened in those caissons beneath the East River. Next time on Hidden America, we'll explore another piece of American infrastructure with a dark history. We'll head west to Colorado and investigate the Glen Canyon Dam, where workers were subjected to extreme heat, dangerous conditions, and the mysterious disappearances of at least 7 workers whose deaths were never officially recorded. What happened in the Glen Canyon caissons, and why has the government refused to investigate decades of missing person reports? If you want to uncover more hidden infrastructure stories, subscribe to this channel. The structures we pass by every day have histories we've been taught to ignore. The bridges we cross, the dams that power our cities, the tunnels that connect our communities, all built with human sacrifice. The stories are still there, waiting beneath the surface. Until next time, remember that the Brooklyn Bridge's beauty comes with a hidden cost. And the bends that plagued its construction are still haunting American engineering to this day.